Praise Jesus. I mean, just, that's what it brings out in me. Well, today, as I said, we begin a long journey through the letter of Paul to the Romans. We're going to be looking at it from now until the first Sunday of Advent, and then we will pick it up again after Christmas and go through Easter. Now, I've said that to a few of you, and the response I usually get is, ugh. Mentioned it to my sister-in-law, Jana, and she said, oh my. And why is that? It's because progressive churches have a little problem with the Apostle Paul. He's got kind of a bad rep. Actually, I'm not sure it's the progressive churches that have a problem with Paul. It's most certainly, though, the liberal churches. You know, when you all called me to this pastorate, the PNC was looking for 5 P's. You wanted preaching, pastoral care, I'm assuming perfection was one, and progressive theology. And the interesting thing is that I think we can distinguish between progressive theology and liberal theology, particularly around the Apostle Paul. Because see, what the liberals have done with Paul's work is they have accepted the conservative fundamentalist take on what Paul has to say. They've accepted a fundamentalist interpretation on what the Apostle Paul says. So you pick up all these illustrations that were culturally bound in Paul, like women not talking in church, or Paul's sense that homosexuality was not an appropriate lifestyle. You take those culturally bound assumptions and you transport them into the 21st century without any consideration whatsoever for what the basic point of Paul's letter was. Furthermore, the classic conservative approach to Paul's work is that Paul is asking for intellectual assent to a set of ideas. And so it is that liberals accept what a fundamentalist thinks about what Paul says and then says, oh, I don't like that, let's get rid of it. Well, we're going to reach for something else. We are going to reach these weeks for a progressive interpretation of what the Apostle Paul has to say to us. And the reason why is when we do, I think it will light you up. Because for century upon century, Paul's letter to the Romans has been lighting people up and changing history. When Augustine got his hands on the letter, it opened his eyes to a church that at that time was bound and determined to be pure, that all preachers and priests had to be absolutely pure before they could serve anyone. And Augustine, reading Paul's letter to the Romans, realized that no, it is God who is working in human beings, and it is therefore God's work through whoever is offering the sacrament. You understand, this was a fight that was life and death, because in those days, bad theology was punished by death. Luther got a hold of that letter, the Romans. Martin Luther got a hold of it, and recognized that it called for a deep and passionate justice, and saw the corruption of the church. And out of a rereading of Paul's letter to the Romans came the Reformation. The beginning of the 20th century, Karl Barth read the letter. And what he had found is that liberals, with a capital L, liberalism is a theological movement. What he found is that as they shucked off all of the claims of the old ways, the conservative theologies, they had lost their moral compass. The church managed to find ways to support the Third Reich in its effort to purify their society. And Barth wrote strong. It exploded. Can you imagine a commentary on the book of Romans becoming a bestseller, people desperate to get their hands on it? Because a rereading of the letter turned the theological paradigm on its head. That's what happens when you reread the Apostle Paul. Paul himself turned things on its head. against violent opposition. By violent, I mean he was put to death for it. The Apostle Paul had something to say. He saw the human condition. He saw that we had this deep sense that we were somehow constrained by the actions of others. Isn't that the way it seems sometimes? Somebody acts one way and we feel like we have to act another way, as though our destiny is somehow mixed up in our biological clocks. As though the biology of our brains is going to tell us what it is that we need to do or not do. The Apostle Paul sees that deep inside each human heart, there is some secret, some hurt, some wound that is not yet healed, that we carry and live with in shame. Don't know what that secret is for you. For some people, we deny it so, put it so far away from us that it is obscured in the effort. The Apostle Paul looks at the human condition and recognizes that that is not fundamentally who human beings are. No. Because it's the power of God that weaves us in to the next step in creation, as though our lives are woven into a beautiful tapestry that makes things whole. That's what the apostle saw in the midst of the story of Jesus. That God was at work saving us from a human condition. It's what the passage was about today. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, the good news. It is the power of God, which is resulting in salvation for everyone who has faithfulness, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed by faith, resulting in faith, as it is written, the one who is righteous will live through faith. Sort of sounds like that old fundamentalist view, doesn't it? You have to have faith. If you don't have the faith, if you're not one of those people that has faith, then how can you possibly be saved? If that's what I thought were going on, if I thought Paul was a misogynist homophobe who demanded that we believe a set of things that no educated person can believe, then I'd toss him out too. But the reality is that that way of interpreting this passage needs to be reread. The Greek word for faith is pistis. Pistis. And it can mean faith, intellectual assent, sure it can, but that's a very anemic view of that word. Now it means faithfulness, it means a trust that orients your life in some direction. And what Paul is imagining here is that Jesus was faithful to the purposes and the creation of God, that Jesus was interested in the justice of God, that Jesus served all that God wanted him to serve. Love, healing, inspiration, acceptance, forgiveness, the righteousness and the faithfulness of Jesus, all the way to the point that he was willing to die for the faithfulness, willing to die for the love of God rather than to destroy others. And as Jesus was faithful, what Paul sees is there's some way in which we feed off that faithfulness. We become connected to that faithfulness when we turn our eyes, our hearts, and our commitment in that place. Some people talk about morphic fields. This sense and feeling that sometimes draws people together in an unusual way. Football fans, for instance. But you turn your eyes towards a tradition and you let it identify you and form you. You become faithful and you know what salvation is. You find yourself transformed by the power of the faithfulness of Jesus Christ. That's how he saw it. That's the way he described his experience. How about you? When you commit your life to the love of God, to the justice that needs to unfold in this world. When your life moves in a direction where you can look somebody straight in the eye and communicate God's love to them, when you hold up a child that's crying, when you treat those that are that have less advantages than you with the kind of heart and soul and connection that makes them feel alive, how do you feel? What are you connected to? That's what Paul calls salvation. It's just a mistake to think that Paul is all about the end of your life, believing some particular thing so that you can make it to a place called heaven. It's a mistake, because Paul is looking for faithfulness in life, because it can save each and every one of you, save me. It can save the world around us, because it is the power of God for salvation. This faithfulness that we tap into and draw off of. So that's the beginning of Paul's letter. A clarion cry to get rid of the idea that you have to be a good person or follow a rule or find a way to coerce other people into doing the right thing. Instead, only an open heart and a deep desire, so that you can be caught up in the fabric of the faithfulness of God's people. You will then know God's love and God's salvation.